There was no moment of silence today among our lawmakers in Washington for this massacre. Usually after the latest gun massacre of American children, they have a moment of silence. They did have one in the U.S. Senate today, but they didn't have one in the House. And that's because they got disrupted in the House. Now, we've got the tape of it. You will actually hear it. You'll hear the disruption happen in this tape, and you'll see members of the House react. But the camera never pans up and shows you who is creating all the ruckus. It's sort of oddly compelling. Just watch this.
The chair notes a disturbance in the gallery in contravention of the law and rules of the House. The Sergeant-at-Arms will remove those persons responsible for the disturbance and restore order to the gallery.
At that point, they cut the audio, but you can see all the members of the House looking up into the gallery. Then the audio comes back on.
The House will be in order. Members will please take their seats. The House will be in order. Members, please take your seats. Please remove your conversation from the House floor.
So you don't see the people disrupting the House there. Because the people who are disrupting the House there, you can see members of Congress looking up at them. Those people weren't even allowed to have their own camera phones up there in the gallery, so they weren't even allowed to document what they were doing themselves. But a bunch of people in the House gallery did get arrested today for this. This is a photo taken of them after they were released from custody. The protesters today in the House were blind people and deaf people and people who use wheelchairs and people with other disabilities. You can see one man who uses a wheelchair getting loaded into a police van here after this disruption. A bunch of Americans with disabilities, including people in wheelchairs, got arrested for this same cause 2 days ago as well. They were protesting in committee on Tuesday. They were protesting on the House floor today because today the Republican-led House of Representatives passed a bill to cut back the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Congressman James Langevin, who has used a wheelchair for decades after an accidental shooting. Senator Tammy Duckworth, who lost both legs in combat as a helicopter pilot in Iraq. Both of them spoke vehemently against this. Congressman John Lewis railed against this as a rollback of American civil rights legislation. But the Republican-controlled House passed it today. And it passed as a standalone thing. This wasn't like, part of the budget or part of some other big spending bill or some other omnibus approach to something where this was a line item. This was its own quiet little standalone bill to gut the Americans with Disabilities Act. And nobody campaigns for Congress by saying, hey, send me to Washington. I'm going to gut the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? Nobody campaigns for Congress by saying, send me to Washington. I'm going to stick it to disabled people. Send me to Washington, and when I take my votes, you'll see blind people and people in wheelchairs being hauled out of the gallery in the House and arrested because I'm taking away the most important parts of the most important legislation that has integrated disabled people into mainstream life and American public accommodation. Right? There's no I'm wheelchair users' worst enemy caucus. Right? So when the Republican-led Congress pursues standalone bills on issues like this, they know they don't want to brag about this back at home. They know nobody promised their constituents they'd make things harder for disabled people when they got to Washington. They like to do these things quietly. And oftentimes these things proceed all the way through both Republican-controlled houses of Congress and all the way to the president's desk without anybody really making any noise about it at all. Except, of course, for the activists who represent these communities whose lives are materially going to get worse because of this rollback of some of the most successful civil rights legislation in American history. They're the ones who make noise. They're the ones who bring the House to a stop, make all those members of Congress turn around and try to figure out what's going on. All right, even when no one inside the House is allowed to turn their cameras toward the gallery to see them, they make themselves heard. On issues like this, that Congress wants to keep as low profile as possible, it's the outcry from the activist groups that is sometimes the only way we know these things are happening. They make sure there's no press for this stuff. There was another quiet little bill like this that passed the Congress 1 year ago today. It was actually the first materially significant standalone legislation that was passed after the 2016 election, where Republicans won control of the House and the Senate and the White House. It was a standalone, single-purpose piece of legislation to make it easier for mentally ill people to buy guns. That's all it did. It passed through both houses of Congress as of 1 year ago today, passed Congress today, went to President Trump's desk, President Trump signed it. You have seen a gazillion photo ops of President Trump signing all sorts of things, right? Sometimes it's legislation, sometimes it's an executive order, sometimes it's a decision memo, whatever that is. Sometimes it's just random pieces of paper to make it look like he's accomplishing something in the legislative process, even when he's not. Anytime they can take an opportunity to have him show off that he's signing a thing, they take that opportunity. Except for the bill he signed that makes it easier for mentally ill people to access guns. CBS News reported today that they have repeatedly requested 12 different times that the White House release a photo of President Trump signing that bill that eased up on our nation's restrictions on people who've been adjudicated to be seriously mentally ill from accessing firearms. CBS News reports today they asked 12 times for it. They report today that a White House photographer has confirmed to them that there are existing photos of Trump signing that legislation about mentally ill people getting guns more easily. But the White House won't release any of those photos. It's almost like they don't want to admit that the first materially significant legislation this president signed was specifically and only designed to get more guns into the hands of more seriously mentally ill people. This, of course, was President Trump's response to yesterday's latest gun massacre. Quote, so many signs that the Florida shooter was mentally disturbed. So many questions about why anybody would take overt action to make sure people adjudicated to be seriously mentally disturbed could get guns more easily. But the president has never answered a question about that first materially significant legislation that he signed. The White House is dodging those questions even now. Even now, they are refusing to release the photo of President Trump signing that legislation, which in fact he signed. So they're not answering questions about it. They canceled yesterday's White House press briefing, canceled today's White House press briefing. Individual members of Congress are having to answer questions here and there, though. MSNBC caught up with Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa today to get his thoughts about what the nation should do to try to stop these gun massacres from happening. This was his response.
We have not done a very good job of making sure that people that have mental reasons for not being able to handle a gun, getting their name into the FBI files, and we need to concentrate on that.
Thanks.
And then he walked away. Now, Senator Grassley speaks in a sometimes elliptical manner. He can sometimes be a little hard to follow. Here's exactly what he just said. We have not done a very good job of making sure that people that have mental reasons for not being able to handle a gun getting their name into the FBI files. And we need to concentrate on that. That's what he said. To be perfectly and specifically clear here, Senator Chuck Grassley was the lead sponsor in the U.S. Senate of the bill that passed 1 year ago today that had one specific purpose, which was to keep people who had been adjudicated as seriously mentally ill from having their names added to the FBI database that he's talking about right there. We haven't done a very good job making sure people who have mental reasons for not being able to handle a gun, they're getting their name into the FBI files. That's what he says the problem is. You have to go really far out of your way to choose as a legislative goal that people who are adjudicated to have serious, debilitating mental illness can more easily get guns by excluding them from the FBI background check database. That has to be a really specific legislative goal. You don't accidentally hit that mark in a standalone bill that only does that. Again, this was not part of any larger piece of legislation. This was not some dumb loophole in a bill that did something more important. This was targeted legislation that did only that. He was the lead sponsor. And now today he speaks in wonder and apparent outrage that for some reason we can't get the names of people with serious mental illness onto the FBI background check database. For some reason. He is personally and individually responsible for that being harder to do today than it was 1 year ago today. Gun laws do not make themselves. We have the gun laws that we have today because of the lawmakers who we have today. None of them received our nation's gun laws on tablets on a mountaintop. They're all in control of what gun laws we have. But if if we were thinking they might reflect on that today in a moment of silence for all these American kids who were just murdered, well, they were scared away from doing their moment of silence on that today because there were people with wheelchairs and people who are blind and deaf trying to stop them from taking the action that they took today to go out of their way to hurt disabled people in America. Your tax dollars at work today.